The first Quincy invasion of the Thousand Year Blood War arc is well known at this point as one of the greatest events, one of the best, most compelling collection of chapters in all of Bleach. In fact, I've evangelized it many times on this channel before, even doing an entire video about why I felt it was so excellent, why I felt it was the ultimate opener to the final arc of the story, why I felt it was Bleach at its best. Since then, many people have asked for a similar video on the second Quincy invasion, a kind of overall retrospective on that section of the story. And while this portion of the story is far larger than the tightly knit experience of that first battle, involving numerous different full-length fights and multiple game-changing twists and turns, I wanted to oblige all the same. The second Quincy invasion is a considerably different beast altogether, where the first battle prioritizes a sense of urgency, presenting a scene of chaos unfolding across an embattled Seirete. The second is a marked change of pace. Though the Vandenrijk's invasion is swift and total, the fight itself is much more drawn out and on a much larger scale. It's here that the Gotei 13 finally mounts a proper defense, taking the fight back to their Quincy invaders. And here we get the bulk of the Thousand Year Blood War arc in one place. Numerous sternritter are properly introduced through their fights, and for the most part, the overall structure of the arc defaults to a much more traditional Bleach fare. It's quite interesting, really, with this being Bleach's war arc. What we see here really is the arc in its entirety. Certainly, the Thousand Year Blood War arc can be broken up as we are doing and will continue to do with these retrospective looks, but this core conflict here is the entire arc encompassed. But of course, this part of the arc will be covered in the upcoming second core of the Bleach anime, so for now, that's where the spoiler-free talk has to end. Moving on, there will be major spoilers for just about everything regarding the second Quincy invasion and the events that take place during it. So, in this video, we'll be taking a retrospective look at the entirety of the second Quincy invasion of the Thousand Year Blood War arc, what's great about it, what's maybe not so good, where it struggles in some places, and how it compares to that first battle with the Quincy, and even what changes I'd like to see made in the upcoming anime. Before we get started on the video, guys, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now for more Bleach content like this every single week, and if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up as well to help support me and the channel. And if you want to take that support from me another step further, I do also have a Patreon as well. And as always, I'd like to give a massive shout out and say a huge thank you to everyone supporting me over there on Patreon. I really do appreciate it. But if you want to support me in an even easier way, you can go and check out my second channel, Mr. Tomo Talks Games. Maybe give it a subscribe. Either way, I really do appreciate the support from each and every one of you. So, if we begin by doing a brief overview, I say brief, I'll try and make it brief, but like I said, this part of the story is considerably more lengthy than the first Quincy invasion, but we'll start by doing a brief overview of the second Quincy invasion itself. Now, unlike that first invasion, the parameters of this one are a little more nebulous. The first battle has a very defined end point with chapter 515 Relics, whereas this one is decidedly more fluid, and really I think it comes down to personal opinion as to where you consider the end of the second Quincy invasion section to be. In my eyes, the second invasion runs from chapter 546 right the way through to chapter 611, featuring the death of the Soul King and the accomplishment of yhwach's goal. This makes sense to me for numerous reasons. Firstly, protecting the Soul King was the main job our heroes had, and so to cap off the second invasion with their complete failure seems fittingly dramatic. The Gotei 13 and Ichigo's gang reaches its next lowest point, following their defeat in the first battle however many chapters ago. Not only that, but it means the final battle of this section of the arc is the cataclysmic duel between Ichibei and yhwach, which again feels righteously grandiose and epic, and almost the perfect way to cap off this next section of the story. Two complete powerhouses, effectively the godlike leaders of their respective armies, fighting to the death on the divine doorstep of the royal palace, is a great bookend to the second major conflict of the arc. Another reason I think this works as the end point is I think everything flows best this way. To my eyes, there's a small gap in the form of another sub-arc between the end of the second invasion and that final showdown in Varvelt. I call this, personally, the Death of the Soul King sub-arc, though I'm sure it probably has an actual name, and it runs for approximately 2 volumes or so before that battle in Varvelt begins. Specifically between about 612 and 628. Going off of this logic, it makes sense to end the second invasion with Chapter 611, as Chapter 612 opens with Renji and Rukia making their way to the Shinigami's makeshift stronghold after yhwach has left the remaining sternritter to die down below. And not only that, but the Shinigami have all been given an urgent order by Urahara to abandon whatever battles they're currently engaged in to arrive at this single point, meaning essentially the battles are all over. And we can already see by looking at the lifespan of this conflict that it's considerably longer than the first Quincy invasion. The second invasion begins suddenly, with the Vandenreich once again catching the Shinigami off guard. In one of the arc's biggest reveals, it's revealed that the Quincy exist literally in the shadows of the Seirete, in a realm called the Schattenbereich. Using their dominion over Reishi, the Quincy replace the Seirete with their own cityscape, essentially flipping the two cities upside down and swapping places. It's never quite explained how this works, but it basically looks like the shadow realm that the Quincy's were hiding in. Their city leaves the shadows of the Seirete and the Shinigami, perhaps rising up around them, and totally replaces the Seirete itself. What's kind of weird about this is it looks like it almost erases the Seirete, pushing the Seirete into the shadows of the Vandenreich city. But later on, when the Vandenreich city is launched into the air by yhwach to remodel the royal palace, it's almost as though they've just been sat on top of the Shinigami building, so it's a little bit weird to wrap your head around, but regardless, we now have a unique battleground for this war. And almost immediately, battles begin to pair off. Toshiro and Matsumoto protect their division from Basbi, while BG9 seeks out Soifon, instead finding Omaida in what was once a residential part of the Seirete. Askin Naklavar appears in the research and development department, only to be confronted by Mayuri and Nemu, and Kyoraku and Nanao are confronted by Hashwolf in the former headquarters of the Captain Commander. As the battles break out, Soifon returns to the battlefield to aid Omaida, and although things look to be going well for the Shinigami initially, the Sternritter quickly turn the tables. Basbi demolishes Hitsugaya, nearly killing the captain, while BG9 knocks Soifon unconscious in a violent explosion. At the last moment, however, Kisuke Urahara contacts Mayuri from Waco Mundo, revealing he has a way to at last restore the captain's stolen bankai. Urahara arrives in the 12th Division's laboratory, which has been turned into an anti-Quincy stronghold thanks to the presence of complete light, which is blocking out all possible shadows. Urahara delivers a pill to each of the captains, enabling them to restore their bankai. Thanks to this, Soifon is able to defeat BG9, and Hitsugaya turns the tables on Kangdu, who arrive to finish him off in place of Basbi. Bambietta Bastabine threatens to destroy a large portion of the battlefield around her, but is stopped by the arrival of Komamura and Shinji. Although Bambietta quickly bests Shinji, Komamura is able to defeat her at the cost of his humanity. Meanwhile, far above the battleground, Ichigo finishes his training with the Zero Division and makes his way down to the Seirete. As night falls across the battleground, Masked Masculine successfully ambushes Ikkaku, Yumachika, and Hisagi, while Hashwolf leaves his fight with Kyoraku to report back to yhwach. Masked Masculine spots 2 bright lights bursting down from the sky above. Renji and Rukia have returned from the royal palace, apparently having finished their training before Ichigo. Although he wants to investigate, Mask is stopped by Kensei and Rose, but he defeats them both. Renji then appears before him and kills the Sternritter with his newfound power, while Rukia takes the seriously injured Vizard captains to Isane, who has set up a makeshift infirmary in secret in one of the Quincy buildings. As the sun rises on the second day of the battle, Rukia leaves the infirmary and is confronted by Asnot. With Byakuya's return to the war after his near death in the first invasion, Rukia uses her bankai to kill Asnot once and for all. Back in the infirmary, Isane and Yachiru, who have been working together to put together a ramshackle hospital for defeated Shinigami, are confronted by Gremmy, who overpowers them until the timely arrival of Kenpachi Zaraki. Zaraki battles Gremmy in one of the biggest spectacles of the arc, revealing his long-awaited Shikai, but Gremmy inadvertently kills himself at the end of their duel. As Zaraki gets his men to search for Yachiru, who has suddenly vanished, the 11th Division is ambushed by the Bambis, who kill numerous officers and mortally wound Zaraki himself. Across the battlefield, Zaraki's defeat is felt by all. Omaida, attempting to carry both Soifon and his wounded sister through the streets, is surrounded by Soldat before being saved by Shinji and Momo. Shinji emphasizes the importance of keeping Zaraki alive, but they're attacked by Bazby, who wants to stop the Shinigami from reaching Zaraki's side. Rukia and Byakuya make their way to the place of Zaraki's defeat, watching as lightning strikes the ground over and over from afar. But suddenly Rukia senses something, a ripple in the air. Just when it looks like it's over for Zaraki, Ichigo erupts onto the scene, landing beside the fallen captain just in time to save him. We're going to take a break there with the overview because in my mind that's the natural midpoint of the second invasion. Ichigo's arrival is the true watershed moment, the last in a string of Shinigami arrivals onto the battlefield to help tilt the scales. And honestly, so far, so good. The second invasion may have fallen into a more formulaic trap compared to the first, but honestly, there's very little to complain about so far on a macro level. There are, however, some issues already plaguing this more ambitious battle when compared to the first one, and even in some cases as a result of the first invasion. Let's take a deeper look at what's happened so far and what works as well as what doesn't. First of all, it's interesting trying to approach the second invasion from a kind of top-down perspective like this. It's a lot harder to do than it was for the first invasion. The first invasion was so short and so condensed in comparison that it was very easy to pick out essentially 3 tenets that really made it such a success, whereas here this is a lot bigger and a lot more ambitious in scale, so it's just not quite as simple as there being only certain things that work and basically that's about it. There is things that work and things that don't on both a macro and a micro level when it comes to the second invasion. But first of all, I have to commend how much the second invasion actually feels like a real war already. It does so many things right in that regard, especially when in comparison to the fake Karakura Town battle, which is really the closest comparison, the closest other conflict we have to a war in the series. I mean, it was dubbed the Winter War for a long time, after all. But where that is very much just a series of essentially one-on-one battles for the most part, and I absolutely loved it, but it really is just a sequence of duels with a little bit of change up here and there. The second Quincy invasion blows it out of the water in terms of scope and scale. Yes, the 1v1 duels that Bleach is known for are absolutely here, but there's more to it than that. Firstly, there are foot soldiers involved on both sides. This might seem like a silly, tiny little thing, but actually it's quite a big component of making this feel like a huge fight. It's not just being left to the captain-ranked Shinigami, unlike the fake Karakura Town battle. Here, everyone is forced to get involved, whether they want to or not. Seeing Shinigami officers gathering together, cheering for their captains, their morale increasing or decreasing depending on how the battle is going, is a great show of the collective nature of what the Gotei 13 truly is. It's not just a few special people at the top, it's an entire military organisation. And conversely, seeing the Soldat pinning down Omaida is really sinister. There's more danger to be found in these Quincy streets than just the powerful sternritter. Nowhere is safe. Secondly, I love the progression of time in this conflict. While I think Kubo sometimes forgets about it and lets it flag a little bit later on, it's nice to see that continuous through line of day turning to night and so on. It helps it feel like this is actually a big, drawn-out fight, whereas, for all I know, the long-awaited momentous battle in fake Karakura Town was over in a matter of an hour or two. So the progression of time works really, really well, as does seeing the Shinigami in various pockets across the entire scope of the war zone itself. With their territorial advantage gone, I love seeing Isane trying to put together a place to heal injured Shinigami in secret. I love the little details incorporated, like Yachiru stealing Quincy mattresses for them to use. I really enjoy seeing tiny, unusual alliances being formed even if they're only fleeting. Hisagi meeting up with Ikkaku and Yumichika, Omaida being saved by Shinji and Momo. All of this helps to create a sense of isolation and alienation that's forcing a real camaraderie between Shinigami officers separated across the battlefield. In the Fake Karakura Town battle, and it feels like I'm dunking on this fight a lot, and I do love it genuinely, but it is the closest comparison to be made. It feels small scale because everyone can see everyone else at all times. There are no real barriers anywhere. There's always that lingering thought in the back of your mind that if he really wanted to, Yamamoto could probably just step in and annihilate the top three Espada and their fraction almost immediately. Here, the vastness of the cityscape combined with the fact that it is enemy territory does wonders for creating that sense of unease. The Shinigami are having to go out of their way to find and help one another, and this is reinforced by the knowledge that the Quincy have made the reishi density enormously thick to both hide their own movements and siphon off the Shinigami from their allies. Divide and conquer. All of that is great stuff. I love all of that. And on top of that, several of the fights we do get to see here are genuinely some of the best the final arc has to offer. Rukia versus Asnot, Kenpachi versus Gremmy, Komamura versus Bambietta. These are all fantastic battles that we get to see through to the end, from start to finish, basically totally unbroken, and all of them are likely to go down in Bleach history as total fan favourites. So the setting, the scope, the feel of the battle itself, and some of the fights are all wonderfully executed so far. But what about the things the second invasion either doesn't do that well or simply drops the ball on? Well, like I said, generally speaking, this first half on a macro level is pretty solid altogether. The battle swings back and forth realistically between the two sides, even if the Shinigami are now beginning to rack up more and more victories overall. Where the second invasion fails initially, in my opinion, is in the way it fails the first invasion. The first invasion sets up a lot of developments, a lot of grudge matches. It gave us several sternritter to be intrigued by. Specifically, the main development it set up was the stealing of the bankai. And then the second invasion undoes literally all of that. Now, I have no issue with the way the Shinigami get their bankai back. In fact, I actually think it's pretty clever, building on revelations presented to us in Everything But the Rain. I just think it was way too soon. Two of the sternritter who stole bankai, BG9 and Bambietta, never even get to use them. Not only that, but Toshiro basically doesn't fight Kangdu at all. Instead of building up these particular villains as major personal enemies to their respective captains, they're all done away with extremely fast. Really, I would argue only Asnot manages to actually complete this development in a way that's satisfying. The way Kubo chews up and spits out sternritter like they're nothing is a big part of why they mostly failed to capture audiences on the whole. Instead of building on the foundations he laid in that first invasion, he quickly kills them off to focus on yet another set of sternritter instead, who will in turn be killed off fairly rapidly too. It was a big mistake, I think, and so the biggest events, the most impactful plot developments of the first invasion have been almost entirely done away with in a way that's very neat and leaves little to no lasting impact. Again, I don't mind this turning of the tables at all, I just think it should have come a bit later in the fight. The second issue is somewhat adjacent to this one, but the formulaic approach Kubo takes to battles in the second invasion only serves to highlight how little we really know or saw of most of the sternritter. Kenpachi versus Gremmy is one of, if not the biggest fight of this conflict, and yet Gremmy himself exists completely in a vacuum. I've mentioned before how strange it actually is when you stop to think about it. Gremmy does not exist in the source material outside of Volume 64. He arrives out of nowhere to fight Zaraki, gets a pretty huge battle, and then dies before the volume even wraps up. His entire existence is then wrapped up in that one fight, and it's just weird to think about. Then there's Bambietta, who is positioned as a fairly major sternritter in terms of characterization, but she's defeated by Komamura in about 3 chapters without really having any impact on the wider war, and not seen again until the second half of the invasion, and in a much worse state. I mentioned in my video on the first invasion that that fight was always going to be tough to live up to, but the second invasion fails it and its characters in some instances, and this continues through to the second half of the fight too, where I think things do start to get quite messy. Sometimes bigger isn't always better, and particularly after Ichigo's arrival, Kubo seems to lose control of his creation in a big way. No matter what issues you or I might have had on a micro level with the first half of the second invasion, at least from the perspective of the bigger picture, things were moving pretty smoothly and at a decent clip. But once the second half rolls around, that all changes, and gone are the tightly woven sequential battles. Yes, they might be formulaic, but at least they weren't messy. In fact, for this upcoming second half, messiness is kind of the name of the game. And so, to continue with our overview, Ichigo arrives on the battlefield and rescues Zaraki, taking on the Bambis himself. After a brief battle with Candice, Ichigo's fight is interrupted by several more sternritter who swarm the arena. Bazby, Pepe, Robert, and Nanana all arrive, each one hoping to land the killing blow on Ichigo himself and be showered with glory by yhwach. Now, out of nowhere, Ichigo is facing down a whopping 8 sternritter, which is both a cool scenario for our main character, who looks more confident than ever, and a pretty quick way to undermine the strength of these sternritter as individuals. Before Ichigo can fight them all, however, yhwach announces his plan to assault the royal palace. Thanks to Ichigo arriving, he's broken the force fields that protect the palace itself, allowing yhwach to enter unimpeded. Ichigo races to stop him, but the sternritter stand in his way, only for several members of the Gotei 13 to take them on, allowing Ichigo passage. At yhwach's tower, Ichigo is horrified to see Uryu standing with the Quincy king. After a very brief confrontation, Uryu turns his back on his friends and ascends with yhwach to the palace above. The sheer force of yhwach's power sends a massive shockwave rippling across the battlefield, scattering the combatants far below. Ichigo, Orihime, and Chad are saddened by Uryu's seeming betrayal, but resolve to get him back. Urahara arrives and promises to help them reach the royal palace, but claims he'll need some time. Meanwhile, the Gotei 13 and Sternritter forces were all split up by the shockwave. Renji and Rukia are now facing off against Bazby, while other battles break out too. yhwach, Hashwolf, and Uryu arrive in the royal palace, where they're confronted by Korinji Tenjiro. And meanwhile, Urahara reveals a near-perfect replica of the Kukaku crane cannon deep within the bowels of the 12th Division's lab, which he plans to use to blast Ichigo and the others up to the palace. Yorioichi arrives on the scene, having worked with the Vizards of Karakura Town to gather the energy they need to soar to the palace itself. And meanwhile, the battle continues as the second invasion slowly begins to wane. Ikkaku and Yumichika face off with Giselle Jewel, who uses the now zombified Bambietta to fight them. Mayuri and Nemu arrive, and using both his technology and some Arrancar zombies of his own, battles Giselle. Giselle reveals that she has been zombifying Shinigami since the battle began, revealing that she has Toshiro, Rose, Kensei, and Matsumoto under her command. With the help, however, of his scientific drugs and concoctions, Mayuri is able to emerge the victor, taking Giselle's own zombies as his new minions. At the same time, across the city, Byakuya has defeated 3 Sternritter, Candice, Robert, and Nanana, without so much as taking a hit. However, the Sternritter Pepe has managed to ensnare Hisagi in his power and uses him to attack Byakuya before taking out both Mendinas and Little Toto himself, again in an attempt to steal all the glory. Byakuya is pushed into a corner by both Pepe and Hisagi, but is saved by the arrival of Mayuri and his corpse unit, which now includes both Kensei and Rose. Pepe is killed by Little Toto, who devours him out of revenge. Back in the royal palace, yhwach circumvents Tenjiro without so much as a battle before being intercepted by Senjumaru and her divine soldiers. Yhwach reveals another sternritter, Nyanzol, who has been protecting him in secret from the shadows until now. Back in the 12th Division laboratory, Ganju also shows up, bringing with him a map of the passage to the palace. Urahara blasts Ichigo and the others towards the royal palace to try and stop yhwach. On their way into the sky, Orihime reminisces about their adventure into the Soul Society so long ago. Meanwhile, Senjumaru kills Nyanzol almost immediately before being confronted by yhwach's elite guard, the Schutzstaffel, who take the fight to the Zero Division, seemingly overpowering them instantly. However, it's all a ruse. The Zero Division has successfully trapped the Schutzstaffel and now prepares to kill them all. Oetsu takes on all 4 members of the elite guard at once, cutting them all down swiftly and without issue. Only Askin, newly promoted, puts up any kind of a fight, but he too meets his demise on Oetsu's blade. As Oetsu prepares to take on yhwach himself, yhwach initiates another Auswählen, the first since he used it to rob Ichigo and Uryu's mothers of their powers all those years ago. Down below the battlefield is a total mess. A seriously wounded Giselle tries to steal back her blood from Bambietta, killing her again in the process. Little Toto finds her, but Robert ambushes them both, revealing they've all been deemed expendable by yhwach. As he says this, with great timing, yhwach's Auswählen kills him before robbing the other Sternritter of much of their power to help revive the Schutzstaffel. In the palace above, the Schutzstaffel are now able to quickly overpower and kill the Zero Division, while yhwach prepares to battle the Zero Division's leader, Ichibei Hyosobe, at the gates to the palace. After a brutal battle where Ichibei gets the upper hand on yhwach, sending him soaring back down to the Seirete far below, yhwach's true power awakens, and using his Shrift the Almighty, he successfully kills Ichibei before storming the Soul King's palace. Ichigo and the others arrive in time to see the devastation caused by yhwach and his men. After Ichigo helps Ichibei restore his body, Ichibei pleads with them to stop yhwach, but they're too late. Chapter 611 ends with the reveal that yhwach has already reached and stabbed the Soul King, revealed to be his father. Phew, and that's the second half of the second Quincy invasion, at least by my parameters anyway. As you can see, a lot happens in this portion of the story, probably too much. This is where it feels the most like things got pretty messy and frankly out of control. But it's not all bad, and as we did with the first half, let's begin by looking at what this part of the story manages to actually get right. Overall, there are fewer completed fights in general in this part of the battle, and really there are only 2 that feel like actual successes to me. Mayuri versus Giselle, and of course, Ichibei versus yhwach. The former is a fun fight that features some really great cameos, making it feel totally unique among the rest of the crowd. It's a shame the fight doesn't quite get proper closure, and in fact the structure of that section in general is very odd, but for what it's worth, I enjoy this fight quite a bit. Getting to see Mayuri take on Hitsugaya isn't something I expected to see, but it was great all the same, and Kubo's creativity with Mayuri's drugs and experiments is always a delight. But I have to give credit where it's due. This portion of the story harbours one of the best fights in not just the 1000-Year Blood War arc, but probably the entirety of Bleach itself. Ichibei vs yhwach is a legendary, titanic clash between 2 of the most powerful beings of this world. If you told me 10 years before I read this chapter that one day I'd witness a fight between the leader of the Zero Division and an ancient Quincy king fighting for access to the royal palace, I wouldn't have believed it. It sounds too much like fan fiction in a good way, but it happens and it's amazing, truly. Easily one of the best bouts of the entire story. In fact, there is a nice sense of urgency with everything surrounding the royal palace in general. I've said it before that the problem with the battle in the palace is that it's all set up and no payoff. And that's true, but what setup there is here is honestly pretty good. Chapter 599, Too Early to Win, Too Late to Know, is a real standout in my opinion, as yhwach unleashes his elite guard upon the Zero Division for the first time. It's just a shame that what follows regarding the rest of the Zero Division ends up falling flat. I also enjoy seeing Ichigo finally arrive on the scene and be treated with such gravitas and power, the kind he deserves. Kubo really makes him feel like the main character he is here, and although we never really get to see it play out, the idea of Ichigo casually duking it out with 8 captain-class enemies is pretty amazing. So what doesn't really work here? Well, to be honest, I think this portion of the story, the second half of the second invasion, is probably the weakest part of the 1000-Year Blood War arc on the whole. And that's not saying too much, because this portion of the story is really only, about 30 chapters, not even that. But this definitely does feel like the messiest portion. There's a lot being crammed into these 30 chapters. It really feels like Kubo was suddenly overwhelmed, as if he realised too late that he had far too many characters left to deal with by the time Ichigo arrived on the scene. And as a result, the quick dispatching of Sternritter reaches epidemic levels here. Meninus and Lil Toto are wiped out by Pepe without so much as a fight. Candice, Robert and Nanana are all defeated off-screen by Byakuya. Pepe's fight lasts a meagre 2 chapters before being turned into a joke, and Nyanzol is killed almost as soon as he's introduced. Even Basby, whose fight with Renji and Rukia, something that could have been huge with fans, is basically skipped over entirely. When you take a step back and look at all the characters introduced during that big skirmish to both defeat and protect Ichigo, it is crazy to think that Giselle is really the only one who gets a halfway decent fight. Robert is another great example of a character that was set up in the first invasion to be something special, or at least somewhat interesting, but is completely thrown aside here in the second, killed by yhwach, destined to be nothing but fodder for stronger foes. But the structure of the story as well is now all over the place. Ichigo spends roughly 30 chapters journeying down from the royal palace, only to almost immediately turn right around and head straight back up again, in what is one of the clearest examples of Kubo not really knowing what to do with his main character during this segment. Ichigo spends fewer chapters actually partaking in the battle here than it takes him to arrive. It's madness. Not only that, but while I like the concept of zombies for the most part, it does become overbearing and unwieldy here. Both Mayuri and Giselle control zombies, which works perfectly for their specific battle, but it eventually spills over into the rest of the war. Before Mayuri's fight is even wrapped up, he intervenes in Byakuya's battle, and then we're treated to a flashback showing how Giselle was defeated mere chapters earlier. And now we have zombies on top of zombies, and what's worse is these are characters people would have liked to have seen in action themselves. It's not quite as big a deal when it comes to actually dead characters being brought back to life for nice cameos. That's really cool, and ironically, in that instance, for example, the Priverone Espada, they actually keep their personalities. They are basically the exact same characters they were all those years ago. The characters that people wanted to see in action, characters like Kensei and Rose, however, are reduced to mindless slaves, robbed of any agency and personality. If their zombified states had been very similar to the Priverone Espada, and they were able to regain at least some semblance of who they were, it might have been a little better. The biggest issue, really, with the second half of the second invasion is there's a sense that Kubo wanted to do so much, tried to do too much, and as a result we never really got to see much of anything. There's a lot of promised fights, a lot of battles being set up, but nothing ever really comes of them. Plot points are actively dropped mere chapters from when they were introduced. For example, Nanana spies on Renji after the latter defeats Master Masculine, which seems to be setting up their inevitable battle. But for whatever reason, both of these characters arrive at the same place later on at different intervals, and this moment is completely forgotten about. And what's even weirder is that it's Nanana who arrives first. It's not like he was still following Renji at the time they both appeared, he clearly just decided to abandon him altogether. In fact, where the 1000-Year Blood War arc has been a pretty tightly plotted, tightly woven story up until now, this is where plot points do seem to become a little more arbitrary, almost. For example, yhwach reveals that he can assault the royal palace thanks to Ichigo arriving, thanks to him using his Oken clothing to blast down towards the Seirete, inadvertently destroying many of the force fields that protect the royal palace. But I have to say, like, how does this even work? How was yhwach planning on reaching the royal palace if Ichigo never turned up, or if he didn't turn up using that particular method? Did he have any plan, or was he just completely winging it? And do Renji and Rukia arriving in the exact same manner hold no bearing on the force fields themselves? Could yhwach have made his way up earlier, or did he need all three of them to come through, perhaps? But even then, it's still like a massive gamble on his part. I have no idea what he was planning on doing otherwise. And another plot point that's really weird is that the 12th Division happens to have a perfect replica of the Kukaku Flower Crane Cannon, but to make sure it can't be abused for narrative purposes, apparently it collapses after one use. That sort of thing is very random, I guess is perhaps the best way of describing it, and unlike the tightly woven narrative the Thousand Year Blood War arc has been doing so far, it all kind of feels like it comes out of nowhere. And actually a great comparison to showcase the difference, I think, between the first half of the second invasion and the second is, like I said earlier, the method for regaining bankai, although I think it comes too soon, is really clever. I think it's really smart, it's really well plotted, and it references back to major plot points we saw in Everything But the Rain. And then you have these kind of plot points in the second invasion that kind of just come out of nowhere, and in many ways barely even make any sense. And then there's the battle in the Royal Palace, which has been lambasted a lot by the community, so I won't go into it too much here. In fact, in my video looking at the biggest changes I wanted to see the anime make, a proper fight here in the palace between the Zero Division and the Schutzstaffel was all the way up there at number 2. And interestingly, my number 1 has already been done to a degree. But this fight is a prime example of Kubo successfully building up a tense conflict, one that looks about ready to explode with the slightest spark, only to then disappoint on both sides with deflating performances. Oetsu single-handedly wiping out the Schutzstaffel is a great showcase for him, but a terrible showcase for these new Quincy. How are we meant to take them seriously now, and in fact, are they even still alive anymore? Or is this just another group of sternritter that have been instantly killed off? Well, they are alive, and now they're actually stronger than ever, but the issue here is we don't even really see them fight. Time is now so short that the Zero Division are just wiped out off-screen instead. So in the end, what was originally a great showcase for Oetsu is now just a bad showcase for everyone. And again, we're treated to the same issue we had in the first half of the second invasion regarding the Sternritter. Rather than let people get to know these characters, many of the latest batch of Sternritter are all killed off to make way for this final group instead. So the group of Sternritter that the Sternritter of the first invasion was sacrificed for are now in turn sacrificed for the Schutzstaffel. Thankfully, the Schutzstaffel would now stick around until the very end. But that's kind of it for my retrospective look at the second Quincy invasion. It's a very mixed bag, and the most uneven portion of the final arc for sure. It harbours some truly fantastic moments sprinkled into the segment of story that well and truly feels the most like a chaotic war. Battles like Ichibei and yhwach, Kenpachi versus Gremi, Rukia versus Asnot, and more will be remembered as some of the best Bleach has to offer. This is absolutely where the Thousand Year Blood War arc truly opens up, and it gets pretty ambitious at times. Kubo is juggling a lot of characters and a lot of scenarios. Unfortunately, that definitely gets the better of him in the second half of this conflict. And while I think the first half honestly comes together really well, minus a few minor hiccups, it's the second where the strain begins to show, and where I think the anime would do well to tighten a few of the screws. It's already confirmed that we're getting our first brand new fight here, and that's really exciting, and maybe it'll help plug a few of these character gaps. I've already speculated that I think this new fight could very well be Shinji versus Bazby, perhaps, in which case that would be great because it would give Shinji a chance to shine while also giving Bazby a little more to do to establish him as one of the biggest threats in the enemy army. But actually, with Kubo's verbiage, the way he says he provided the animators with pages including how these characters came together, it makes me think it might be two characters that never even really interacted on screen at all, in which case I would absolutely love something like Byakuya versus Robert, you know, something like that would be great. And there's an argument, of course, to be made that, well, people just die in war. People get taken out in war. Things aren't always glorious in war. Characters don't always get a chance to shine, which might explain why characters like Candice, Robert, and Nanana are taken out so swiftly and so seemingly easy. But I would argue that this is a visual medium. It's a visual story. Kubo can create the narrative however he likes, and there are loads of characters that many of us wanted to see actually get some spotlight. So I'd be up for seeing really anything like that getting amended, getting tweaked in the anime to come. I have a feeling, I've got no certainty around this whatsoever, but I have a feeling that the second invasion could be the part that's maybe changed up the most, specifically that second half where some issues do begin to rear their head. But on the whole, I do still love the second Quincy invasion, and while this is the portion of the story I have the most issues with, I still absolutely enjoyed it, found it so very exciting, especially that first half where we got those great fights. There really is so much to enjoy here. I would just love to see that back end neatened up a little bit. Really, the biggest problem facing the second invasion is that it is the absolute bulk of this arc, so Kubo had to get a lot done here. It really is very ambitious and large scale, and it is also sandwiched between two excellent sections of the story. The first invasion, which we've gone through already as being amazing, and the Varvelt Showdown, which we'll also do a video on in the future, which I think returns to that slightly more formulaic style, but also, again, works really very well. But that's it for the video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments below how you felt about the entirety of the second Quincy invasion. Do your thoughts mirror mine at all? Do you agree with my opinions, my pros, my cons of this part of the story? I'd love to hear down below. Until next time, though, guys, make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't done already. Give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. And until then, I'll catch you later. And I'll see you then.